Doug, you know that I am a fan of legendary New Orleans jazz.
I do know that.
Yeah, and in fact, we've been to one of New Orleans jazz legends.
Oh.
What was the name of the fucking place? It just slipped my mind. That's how much I love it. The Preservation Hall. And
wonderful night there.
There's no greater classic New Orleans jazz song than "When the Saints Go Marching In." Yeah,
they named a whole football team after it.
They sure did.
Val Kilmer's best movie by far.
When the Saints Go Marching In.
That's right.
Yeah, a football team with a big dum-dum of a quarterback that is now in trouble because he's a racist. So anyway, that's all I have to say about Saints. What, Dan, you have anything to say?
Well, we have been known to talk about Saints from time to time on this little program.
And whether
of
they
ours.
march in or out, we're ambivalent.
And who knows what what they're carrying as they march. And it seems like when we do talk about Saints here, there are basically two categories. There are the sort of more ancient saint stories, which are so garbled and overblown that it becomes instantly clear that either their stories are wildly exaggerated, or they are a combination of a few different people, or they never actually existed at all, which is almost always the case.
Right.
It's super easy to dismiss a story that's so outlandish that it ends with a guy parading around carrying his own disembodied head.
Yes.
That's not a miracle. That's a Wes Craven rejected. That's a concept Wes Craven rejected for being, quote, too campy.
Yeah, and he rejected no premises.
I was about to say he rejected an idea?
Yeah, exactly. So then there are the more recent saints, the ones that we have much better documentation for, who we know existed, and we have their writings, and we have firsthand accounts of who they were and how they acted. We know to some extent what their lives and works looked like. So today's saint falls into that category. So let me take you back in time to 1794, when a 36-year-old Spanish Franciscan friar first landed in the Americas. Padre Junipero Serra was let's call him a devout man. And his brand of devotion was, what's the word? Potent? Extreme? Insane? Yeah, that's close enough. Let's go with insane. And to illustrate what I mean, let's just talk about when he first came to our humble hemisphere. Father Serra landed with a group of other friars at Veracruz, Mexico. Together, they made the arduous 250-mile trek on the Camino Real, which... Doug, I'm going to go to you for translations here on a lot of these things. Camino Real, what does it mean?
The Royal Road.
The Royal Road or the Royal Trail, to Mexico City. This was a tough journey, not only because it cut through dense tropical forests, but also because it climbs 7,400 feet in altitude in the process. The friars were given horses, but our boy Junipero declined because Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of the Franciscan order, had once said some damn fool thing about friars not riding horses unless they were totally infirm or something. Such was Serra's devotion that he walked. And that turned out to be a pretty shitty idea because jungles, it turns out, are full of creepy crawlies, and something bit his foot. By the end of the day, he could barely stand and had a fiery itch that was driving him bonkers. And he scratched so much that by the next morning, his leg was a bloody mess. Ugh. Well, not to worry. Open wounds do really well in damp tropical climates, right?
With the medicine of the time, I'm sure just a little bleeding and you'd be fine.
Yeah, exactly.
I love the idea that he's so devout. He's like, dear Lord, I will prove my devotion by what? God damn it, ow!
What is that, a mosquito? No!
I got the poison ivy.
Yikes. Anyway, it did shockingly become infected, and homeboy had a fucked up leg for literally the rest of his life. Now, I had considered telling that story along with some joke about him limping around like Paul Bettany's character Silas, the albino monk in the Da Vinci Code, only instead of a silice, Serra had a mosquito bite. But here's the thing. This motherfucker actually was like Silas. He was 100% into self-mortification. He wore a cilice.
Really?
Maybe not the spiked metal garter around the leg, but he would wear a sackcloth hair shirt spiked with bristles, or a coat that had broken wire woven into it.
Oh.
He used to whip himself with a chain of spiked iron links.
Oh, my God.
In one story, he was giving a sermon in Mexico City, and he brought out that chain, pulled down his robe to reveal his naked back, and started whipping himself in front of the parishioners.
This is a man well suited for mosquito bites. Is what
Right.
you're saying.
Exactly.
I'm saying he was fine with it.
Yeah.
And boy, talk about an object lesson. That will have an effect. Folks were apparently weeping in the pews, and then one guy, after he had been doing it for a minute, got up, grabbed the whip from the padre's hand, and proclaimed that it was he and not Serra who was sinful, and he started whipping himself.
Oh, boy.
And our father Junipero watched proudly as this man mortified his own flesh. Literally mortified, from the Latin meaning put to death, because he was so effective in his self-flagellation that he collapsed and died.
Jesus.
Now, I can't be sure of what Sarah's emotional response to that event was, but given what I've read about the guy, I'm going to guess envious? I mean, that dude showed some devotion.
Yeah, I can see myself in that space and time slowly backing out the front of the church.
Right?
Okay.
So
I was just dropping
here.
off a package.
Right.
I am going to go back out and get another one.
do you know where the non-crazy Catholic church is? Because that's the one I meant to go to.
All the way back. Nope, there aren't any.
Nope, it didn't work. Okay. He had other fun hijinks as well when it came to sermonizing. He was known to hold a crucifix in one hand and a large stone in the other, and then whack that stone against his chest.
Oh,
That was a cute one. Or there was the other one where he would take a 4-pronged candle and lower his chest onto the flames. RuPaul
always says, if you can't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love anybody else? And I just think that he should have listened to that.
I think his love for other people will manifest in ways that you might find predictable. We'll see. He wasn't the only friar to use this kind of self-punishment in his sermons. In those times, it was reasonably common among the insanely zealous subset of monks. But even then, the other priests were like, dude, dial it back several notches. They were probably just jealous that he was so awesome at hurting himself, really. Put it this way about Serra and the reputation he garnered for himself. In 1752, he wrote to the officials of the Spanish Inquisition to ask for an inquisitor to come and check out all the nasty witchcraft and dark sorcery that he was sure was going on there in the Sierra Gorda. When he wrote in, they just gave him the job. They immediately appointed him inquisitor for the whole region right there on the spot, adding that he could also exercise those powers anywhere he did missionary work. Imagine how hardcore nasty you gotta be for the fucking Spanish Inquisition to just toss you a badge and gun and say, get out there, kid, you're ready.
Yeah, he's an inquisitor that plays by his own rules.
Yeah. So that's our guy. Wow. Little snapshot into who he was, but that's not why he was canonized. No, you don't get to be a saint just because you have an unimpeachable auto-violent lunatic credentials. For that, you gotta go big. So, in 1767, due to a bizarre series of circumstances that I don't have time to get into, nor do I actually understand in any way, King Carlos III of Spain got a bee in his bonnet about Jesuit priests. He basically kicked all of them out of all Spanish territories, or imprisoned them, or killed them.
Wow.
That left a lot of religious spaces with no weird virgins with freaky haircuts in charge. So, the Franciscans stepped in. Our boy Junipero was appointed president of the missions of Baja California. Now, I don't know if you fellas know what you fellas know about the missions of California and Mexico. I mostly knew that they were Spanish and that people love the architecture. But apparently they had a purpose. And that purpose was well illustrated by the story of the first mission Serra himself founded, the Misión San Fernando Rey de España de Velicata. I nailed all of that.
That was brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you.
What was the last word?
Velicata, which is a town.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't know what that is.
Yeah. So when Serra, Serra, S-E-R-R-A, say it, Doug.
Well, it would be Serra.
Serra, right.
Yeah.
When Serra and his small band of merry misfits got to Velicata, all he had was a mud hut to do his priesting in, which he did. But here's the thing. He wasn't there to priest at a bunch of already Catholics. His sights were set on bigger game. A few days after Serra's party arrived, he was positively thrilled when a dozen or so indigenous men and boys approached the makeshift church. Here's what he wrote about them. Quote, "Then I saw what I could hardly believe to begin when I read about it, namely, that they go about entirely naked like Adam in paradise before the fall. We treated with them for a long time, and although they saw all of us clothed, they nevertheless showed not the least trace of shame in their manner of nudity. Idiot natives.
Yeah.
They don't even know that they were supposed to feel bad for being naked. What morons." Anyway, that was great as far as Serra was concerned, because this was the whole reason he was there. He was in the Americas to save savage souls. Gleefully, Father Serra greeted them. He gave them figs, and the soldiers that accompanied him gave them tobacco and food. Serra knew that he wouldn't be there long. He was on a journey up the coast, but through an interpreter, he assured his new naked friends that his buddy, another friar, would be staying there and would gladly give them more treats. As Serra's colleague and biographer said, quote, I don't know if this is a quote. He said something along the lines of, spiritual conquest meant enticing Indians with food and clothing, by which means they could be indoctrinated as Christians and gradually acquire a knowledge of what is spiritually good and evil. So that was the name of the game.
Wave off, Native Americans.
At least they were giving them food.
Right?
That's a step up from plenty of missionary work.
Yeah, and I'm sure this is all going to end well.
Yeah. What could go wrong? So yes, that's what they do. They lure in the indigenous folk and teach them about how disgusting and awful they were. To save their gross little souls.
Yeah. Because Jesus loves them.
Right, exactly. Well, you might be surprised to learn that some of the natives didn't really take to this. Weird, right? Even when you give them figs. But that was the whole point of the missions, and Serra was not one for half measures. So buckle up, Indians. Shit's about to get real. He made his way north into what we now call California, which is Spanish for what, Uncle Doug?
California.
That's right. It's a nonsense word that a novelist made up about a fictitious place, probably based on the Arabic word Khalifa. Anyway, that was a tidbit that I had to look up because I suddenly was curious, and apparently it's nothing.
But I believe it's pronounced California.
California!
Yeah. The G. It's a Gal.
California. It's got it's all in the back of the throat.
Yeah. Get to the friar.
Get to the mission. Anyway, the rest of Serra's career and the work that got him his sainthood occurred in modern-day Cali, so let's jump ahead to a little later as the work of the missions really started to take off. Basically, from this point onward, all of his energy was devoted to cleansing the savages of their sins to get them into heaven.
Oh, boy.
I mean, it's nice that he wanted heaven for them, I suppose, but given what we know of his views on how to cleanse himself of sin, this was never going to go well. Father Serra believed with all his fucked up little heart that every heathen death was a desperate tragedy. And why wouldn't he? These poor people were going to hell for eternity, which is totally fucked up. So His sole purpose in life became to convert as many as he possibly could to the obvious truth of Catholicism and save them from their sin, so that they could go to heaven. From his perspective, it sounds like a beautiful idea, and he committed to it, like, all the way. So, what do you do? What do you get when you cross missionary zeal with Opus Dei levels of crazy and Spanish Inquisition-style persistence? Well, let's just say that all those cute little Spanish churches that dot California's coast, the ones that hundreds of thousands of school children and tourists visit every year, would be far more complete if they had iron gates with the saying, El trabajo te libera on them. Doug?
Work will set you free.
Yeah.
Or in German, Arbeit macht frei. Because those adorable Adobe missions were indigenous slave concentration camps.
Jesus.
Oh, boy.
Thousands of American Indians were brought in with the promise of food and education. The Spanish had tools and knowledge that definitely would be useful for the native populations, so there was a real enticement there. But the, quote, education they received didn't include things like, reading and writing. It was entirely about how awful they were and how to Catholic so that they would be less terrible. The only practical training that they got ended up being how to work fields and tend livestock for no compensation. Because here's the thing, once an Indian converted and entered the mission, he wasn't allowed to leave. Oh, and his family too. So our little padre, Mr. Serra, and his ilk felt that the converted needed to be sequestered from the unconverted masses, to keep them from relapsing into their nasty heathen ways. So the best course of action was obviously imprisonment. And the conditions
if you
were...
converted, you went to prison?
You went to... it wasn't prison, it was the mission. Oh, you got to live at the mission forever.
Yeah.
And ever.
It's like the Hotel California, Doug. If you don't want to stay, don't check in. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Is that what the
you
song
can
is
check
based
out
on?
anytime you like, but you can never leave.
Yeah. That will be our first and last Eagles reference ever on the
And they're done. That's right. Yeah. I hate the fucking Eagles, man. And the conditions in those missions were
amazing.
I'm going to call them Christian. In the most horrific and historically accurate meaning of that word. Indian men were whipped and beaten in front of the others when they got out of line in any way. The whole group was kept in a perpetual state of terror. So, that's going to save their souls, right?
Yeah.
Women were whipped too, of course, but they were often taken away so that their screams wouldn't incite the men to violence. Kids over 10 were also considered old enough for a good whipping. Now, our Saint Junipero believed that the natives were basically children, and somehow believed that beating them kept them infantilized, which kept them from sin. So the missions would have up to a few thousand Indians held captive there, in each of them. Often, while the men were sent out to work, the women would be packed by the hundreds into large rooms called conventos, with just a couple of buckets thrown in as toilets.
And just kept in there?
Just kept in there.
Yeah.
So these kinds of conditions...
concentration camp, yeah.
Yeah. So that kind of conditions, combined with the Spanish hobby of introducing new pathogens into indigenous populations, led to horrific illnesses and mass deaths. Here's a fun little quote from a letter Serra wrote to his superior from one of the missions. In the midst of all our little troubles, the spiritual side of the missions is developing most happily. In San Antonio, that's the mission San Antonio, there are simultaneously 2 harvests, one at one time, one for wheat and of a plague among the children who are dying.
Oh.
Cute, right? They're
That's
harvesting
nice.
the children to heaven. Isn't that darling?
Oh, that's so fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, local political leaders actually tried to convince the Franciscans to end their horrific practices and embrace so-called Enlightenment policies in their missionary work. But by that time, the economies of the missions were kind of directly linked to having an unpaid labor force. So
This is awkward.
maybe not. Maybe we'll just keep things as they are.
Yeah.
Of course, history is written by the victors, or in this case, by the people able to write, and the legend grew of a man who valiantly converted thousands of natives to the joyous teachings of Jesus Christ. Also, as is so often the frustrating case with shit like this, several tribes actually stuck to their captors' beliefs and have largely maintained their Catholicism to this day.
Wow.
So, the story that stuck for centuries was of this heroic missionary who founded many of California's most important cities, and thus it came to pass that Junipero Serra was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1988, and then canonized by Pope Francis in 2015.
Are you kidding?
No way.
Both of these popes, as is so often the case, completely ignored the objections raised by historians and native people and decided to just go with the lovely whitewashed story to which there is only one side, so everybody else just shut up. Statues of Saint Junipero
I was about to fucking ask that question.
This is where I know him from. Yeah.
are scattered all over California, from San Francisco's Golden Gate Park to Placita Olvera in downtown L.A. Or rather, they were,
Yes.
because Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis haven't been the only assholes whose images are coming down in this era of finally facing our racist past.
Bye, Felicia.
Right? Emboldened by the movement that finally boiled over after George Floyd's murder, folks have been toppling old Father Sarah as well.
Good.
So, once it came... Now, there's a fun little fact, which is that once a saint is canonized, there doesn't seem to be a mechanism to unsaint them, which means that the Catholics are stuck with this guy basically forever. So that's fun. But at least we, as a society, can stop venerating this monster and all the other ones like him. So I just wanted to bring it up because I applaud the bringing down of this disgusting fella, who's also holding a cross in these statues that are almost always on public land also, which is problematic.
I think I saw the film of the one coming down in Golden Gate Park.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That was pretty awesome. And I think, there's also this this movement among a lot of people to think of Pope Francis as this kind of sweet grandfatherly good guy.
Right.
Well, he's relative to other popes, maybe, but that's a pretty fucking low bar. And if he canonized this guy and having known full well the history, fuck that guy.
Well,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Why do you have to canonize this guy? Like, what was there a fucking lobby? Was there pressure? Like, you know what I mean?
Well,
like, can we just not
he
canonize
has been
dicks?
He's been portrayed as a hero ever since his life. Like, according to Catholic lore, he was like the guy who converted so many people. They just kind of ignored the part where those people were treated in the most horrific ways possible.
Yeah. Well, fuck that guy.
Fuck that guy.
Fuck that guy. There you go. Saint talk.
Saint Junipero. Enjoy, everyone.